Welcome to day one of the International Pure Conference for North America and Europe. My name is Katie McCann, Head of Research Policy and Information at the University of Bath, and I'll be the moderator for track one today. We're in for an afternoon of interesting presentations, and you can submit questions to the speakers using the Q&A button located on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get through as many of those as we can at the end of each session. So now I'd like to introduce you to our first set of speakers. We're delighted that we're joined by Jan Fransen, who is Service Lead for the Research Information Management Systems at the University of Minnesota Libraries. And we're hoping we will also be joined by Brenna Helmstutler, who is Librarian for the School of Information Studies at Syracuse University, but we're having a few technical problems. So Jan will start off the presentation on Beyond the Product, Research Information Management Systems and Use Cases in the US. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Katie. We are hoping we'll be joined by Brenna. I'm going to be taking her side of the presentation. You'll probably be able to tell exactly when her slides change because I will suddenly sound more like I know what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to wing it here, but at least this is a study I know a lot about. I'm going to be telling you about a study that we hope will be published a little bit later this week, and you can bet that you will be seeing a link for it in the on the Slack channel and everywhere else we can put it once it is out. We worked on this project starting about a year ago when we started to put together who we'd be talking to. We had previously, and by we, I'll say of the people on the screen, Rebecca Bryant, myself, Pablo de Castro, and several others had worked on a study that some of you may have participated in a couple, 3 years ago, where we did a survey. And we were trying to survey what are people doing with research information management kind of writ large around the world. We got a lot of interesting information out of that, and we got terrible information from the United States. We decided then that we needed to take a different approach to figure out what was happening in the US with research information management. So we have already a few things up. We've done presentations already. We have hanging together a series of blog posts. You'll be seeing more of those. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the goals that we were going in with. And you can read more about all of this in the various blog posts. We wanted to differentiate what we do in the US from practices in Europe. We wanted to try to unite, not just differentiate, but unite. You know, we're all doing a lot of different things with a lot of different products, but what brings them together? Why would we call this entire blanket of things RIM? And really, we're making the case to the community for why we should be thought of as one type of enterprise system. We wanted to come up with some recommendations for institutional leaders. These things, the RIM systems that we were looking at, evolve in different ways. And from different parts of the university. And we wanted to have a way to have a conversation with leaders about what these systems really should look like and how they should be resourced. We really, because we are librarians, wanted to demonstrate the central role of the library as well. And yeah, form a community of practice. So we did a case study approach. We identified 5 different institutions. You see them there: Penn State, Texas A&M, Virginia Tech, UCLA, and the University of Miami. And we organized a series of interviews with a total of 38 people across all of these institutions. And the slide says 8 institutions. That's because for UCLA, we also talked to UCSF a bit, and also to the University of California. And for Miami, we also talked to the people behind the Florida ExpertNet system. The use cases that we identified, and you can see them spelled out here, how we saw several different systems at different institutions. Only Texas A&M and Virginia Tech have a single system. The others have multiple systems that participate in these use cases. I think the core use cases, without going into too much detail at this point, faculty activity reporting, which we saw at 3 of the institutions, Virginia Tech, UCLA, and Penn State. The public portal, which we did see at all 5. Metadata reuse, strategic reporting and decision support, which we differentiated between those 2. We felt like metadata reuse is basically just taking, say, that list of publications and putting that information on a website without doing anything with that data, just passing the data over for reuse in another place. where strategic reporting and decision support was more about aggregating that data and doing interesting things with it to see, themes that were emerging or how people are collaborating, things like that. I personally was a little surprised to see 2 instances of open access workflow and more coming, because we hadn't heard much about that in the US before, and also because my own institution is not doing that sort of workflow involving our RIM. So I was surprised to see how much was going on. Conversely, I was a little surprised to see how little compliance monitoring was going on. We really only saw it in one of the institutions, with UCLA, and in a really limited way, where we see that as a growing need within the US as more of our federal funders are requiring certain kinds of compliance that we need to report back on. Well, as we were writing up the case studies, we found that we needed a common language to describe the components of each of these systems. Now, it's one thing to say that the system licenses elements or Pure or uses Vivo, but that's only part of what they're doing to keep their RIM system running. So we came up with this framework. It starts at the top with data sources, and it flows through the data store to the consumers of the data that fulfill those use cases. Now, not every case study has or needs each component, and as we applied the framework, we described what the system actually uses, not what the products they license offer. So let's start at the top. We described 3 kinds of data sources. We consider the research outputs to be at the core of the RIM systems. The bulk of those research outputs are publications, and the RIM system uses metadata and databases and indexes that are freely available or licensed by the institution. The other major source of data is local. Most systems use the institution's HR system to identify the employees that are supposed to be included, what are their affiliations, and other information about them that's kept at the institutional level. Awarded grant data and courses taught are also typically coming from these existing internal data sources. And then there's local data. Now, unfortunately, not all the data one might want to use in a RIM system is readily available in another local system. We're thinking here about information individuals might enter for themselves, like research statements, as well as information about centers and institutes who are affiliated with them. More than one of the institutions that we studied had no documented organizational hierarchy that could be pulled directly from a local source. The RIM systems became the first complete documentation of those relationships. Oh, good. I heard some noise and I see Brenna's on. Fantastic. I will pass it over to you when it gets to you, Brenna. So we came up with this framework. Next we'll move on to the data processing layer. Once the sources are identified, they need to be transformed into a single database that can be used to meet those use cases. For getting those publications into a single database is often the biggest lift. There's no one database that has all the publications for all the researchers at the institution. And persistent identifiers, they're just not used as consistently as we might like yet. Also, the publications databases themselves are subject to changing web services and structures. So most RIM systems rely on a publication harvester that pulls candidate publications from one or more databases based on what is known about each author. We identified 4 publication harvesters in our study: Symplectic Elements, Elsevier Pure, and especially the Profile Refinement Service, Ex Libris Esploro, and the Profiles RNS author disambiguation engine that's part of Profiles RNS. Now, although preferred publication databases do vary by discipline, they don't vary a lot by institution. The same can't be said about HR systems, grant tracking systems, and course systems. Even institutions that have the same software will implement it differently, and that's where the ETL processes come in. ETL stands for Extract, Transform, Load, and it's where a lot of the institution's developers spend a lot of their time. You might have also heard them called crosswalks, and I'm sure many of you in the audience are very familiar with what I'm talking about. Well, some institutions rely on data analysts who extract some data every once in a while from those local sources and run queries and processes to load the data. Automating those processes can ensure that the RIM system's data is current and accurately reflects the institution's records. In other words, what we're telling people is if you're planning a RIM system, we suggest you plan for an analyst and some developer time to get that internal metadata to fit to the purpose. No matter how much you automate, there's always going to be a need for a metadata editor. This is where you review everything that comes in from the data sources through the processes above, and also where you enter local and even individual level information that isn't stored elsewhere. And now we get to the data store. The data store might be part of the licensed product, as we see in Pure, or it could be a custom database developed and hosted and maintained by the institution. The data transfer methods are the things we're familiar with, like web services, tools for exporting, reporting. Some of the systems that we saw also have ways to directly query the data using SQL. And then the items on the bottom layer, those refer back to the RIM use cases I discussed earlier. So this is how I would fill this out for the University of Minnesota. One thing is going to stand out here that's very different from the next one I'm going to show you. Pure. Pure is everywhere from the top to bottom here. I know not all of you subscribe to the profile refinement service for data harvesting, but we do, and we consider it a core part of the product. And I'd say the same way down at the bottom layer for the Pure portal. Yeah, I know not all of you use the Pure portal, but we do, and again, we consider that all part of the big picture, that we think of it all as one product. But Pure is really fulfilling different roles all the way along in this framework. Now let's look at a different institution, a really different one, Texas A&M University. So I won't tell you much about Texas A&M, but one thing I will say is they have used their portal for many, or used their system for many of the same things. It's a portal. They do strategic reporting. They repurpose the data on departmental websites, but theirs is really different. They are a very well-known Vivo institution. They contribute a lot to the Vivo community, but the RIM system isn't like just Vivo. Like that only fulfills part of what they need to do. They license elements for their publication harvester. They told us they thought about writing their own publication harvester and then realized that the upkeep on that, because of all the changes that happen to all of these different databases along the way, was just going to be too heavy a lift. So they licensed a product. They have a custom profile editor for the people listed, and the data are stored in a MySQL database. They've written their own middleware layer for internal developers to use when extracting that RIM data. And yeah, the public portal, that's Vivo. And now I think, Brenna, I'm going to pass it over to you for takeaways.
Apologize for my lateness into the session. Major technical difficulties that you only think are going to happen in nightmares, but they came true for me. Anyway, the takeaways based on our study. Let me get to my notes here. Based on the goals, analysis, and findings that the project team reviewed, these are the takeaways of the report. These are primarily directed towards institutional leaders, RIM practitioners, and research library leaders, as was mentioned in the goals section, but it really could also be relevant for staff who may be involved in the development and implementation phases of a new RIM system. So I'll just read these out very quickly. Investing in institutional data curation is definitely an important takeaway. Also supporting adoption of persistent identifiers such as ORCID. Don't expect a turnkey system, even if that's promised to you, because there's always something that may go awry. Or there may be some sort of customization within the institution that causes that to need to be like more developed first. Support cross-functional teams to ensure that there's a lot of varied expertise, and also investing in dedicated personnel related to supporting cross-functional teams, dedicated personnel that have the time that is really involved in creating a robust RIM, and also including research information and enterprise data governance efforts. And last but not least, that libraries are essential partners in research information management based on our connecting expertise with metadata and research, faculty research in particular, as well as outreach. So all of those have essential elements in the RIM system process, and having it be an effective system for the research institution.
And with that, I think we're ready for questions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much, Jan and Brenna, and I'm glad you managed to join us, Brenna. It was lovely to hear from you.
I'm always happy to see you, Brenna, but never more so than right now.
I know. You did a wonderful job, Jen. No problems there.
That was a really interesting presentation and fascinating to think about. And one of the things that it triggered for me thinking was, you've obviously both coming from a library perspective, and you referenced cross-functional teams. And I wondered if you could expand a little bit on how those cross-functional teams, who those would include, but also coming from a research office perspective, what's your experience of the engagement of research offices in particular with RIM as part of your study?
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead, and then Jan can certainly add her perspective. I know in my case, I'm part of the Pure administrative team at Syracuse University, and that is made up of, jointly managed by the libraries and the Office of Research. So that's definitely sort of definitely an organic fit in terms of managing the different roles that we have in managing the RIM. So that's one aspect of that. And I think in terms of cross-functional teams, I think it's ideal to have it be sort of a campus initiative instead of having maybe one unit be sort of the team, although that could happen, because I know within my library system, we have an IT, we have our own IT, and have other kinds of expertise in the library, so that could potentially happen. But I think it's ideal to have it be a campus initiative and have maybe, at least a couple of units supporting the RIM. And it could be obviously more than that if there's maybe faculty affairs who may have some sort of perspective that could be very valuable to share, and things like that. So I think it's valuable not only from, having that as a team from, people from different offices, but that sort of supports the fact that a RIM as a campus support in research, more so than having it be attributed to one unit.
And I will
Absolutely.
add that that's actually rarely what we saw, partly because these use cases each sort of evolve separately with different users and different different objectives and different timelines. One case that I will point out is, I'm sure that they're in our audience today, the people that we spoke to at Penn State who run the Pure system. That's run out of their research office, but with a lot of support from their health sciences library as well. The overall library is involved, but they're really primarily involved in the faculty activity reporting system and working with that. The two of them do come together. They're now, after both of these systems have been running for a little while, and I hope I say this all correctly, since there are people in the audience who know, they bring the two together. They bring data from the two together in a database, a centralized database that can then be used for strategic reporting and things like that. And kind of bring the best of what they can get from that faculty activity reporting and what they get in their Pure data. So I think that's a really interesting case of a partnership. We see another one of the cases that we looked at, Virginia Tech, where they do have one system, and it has taken a really long time to build that up and get to the point where they are now, where the system is considered a part of the central university, an enterprise level system, or at least enterprise level data, with a bunch of different components again.
That's really interesting, and some very different approaches there. So that's fascinating. I've got some questions come in from the audience. One of them would like to know, in what journal will this very interesting and useful research be published? And we're looking forward to reading it.
This will be published by OCLC. I didn't even talk about OCLC just for time, but OCLC is a consortium for libraries, mostly in the US, but also, of course, also internationally. And they are publishing it. It will look beautiful. It will be two parts. One part will be talking about kind of the setup, the framework, the takeaways, things like that. And then the second part is each of the 5 case studies with much more detailed information about that. So we do hope to see that this week. It will be open access, openly available, and you will see links everywhere I can think to put links. And I'm sure many more places that I haven't thought of that Rebecca Bryant will think of. So
Excellent. Well, we look forward to reading it. Thank you. We've also had a question come in saying, do you depend on self-reporting or entering of data by researchers?
hmm.
Is that part
um,
of your data entry and data collection?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one too. We do at the University of Minnesota. We rely primarily on what we get from Pure, but from there, people can add whatever they want through the metadata editor. So yeah, for that, we are relying on self-reporting. But not every system we looked at allows that. Some of them are very heavily curated. I'm thinking particularly of Texas A&M. I think they have like a couple of people who have access to elements and they do all the claiming for everybody and people can submit what else they want to add. So yeah, I think we see a little bit of a range there, but there's always room to add more than whatever the harvester is would bring in. Brenna, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's great what you said. And then again, just speaking of Syracuse as an example, there's several different models, but there's typically, in some cases, faculty enter their own data, but more often so, it's either either students that are specifically hired to add to do data entry, or maybe others in the administration that may be charged with that role. But there are some schools that sort of put not a mandate, but they sort of say, if you want to be visible, if you want your research to be visible in this newsletter, you may want to make sure your profile is updated. And experts at Syracuse. So there's some schools that have made a real effort and initiative to make the data robust, because it's only a win-win for the faculty, for the department, or school or college to have that visibility and to be able to use that data in other ways, especially for reporting.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we've got time for one last question. So I'm going to go with a question here focusing on the US, asking, is there much interest in the US for content types other than publications? So for example, recording of knowledge exchange activity, impacts, those kinds of things.
Yes, and I would say probably growing. One of the issues, of course, is how easy is it to get that information? One thing that I don't know that we actually found a place to fit it into the report, but it totally needs a discussion, is just all of the output by humanities scholars. Um, and maybe going a little bit, anybody who works in an area where their central means of communicating their research is not a peer-reviewed journal article, we still have a lot of issues filling in those gaps. So any kind of activity that we can get, we try to put it in, but that all has to be manually entered, adding really to the workload. Impacts, yeah, for sure. Although I don't think we have like an agreement or even a really good idea of how we want to report that or how we would want to capture that information. Definitely, we're looking at others who are doing it in a little bit more top-down way to see how they're doing it and how that would fit in.
Okay, that's very helpful. I would say, in the UK, we're struggling with exactly those same issues as well. We've been having very, very similar conversations. So that's reassuring on one level. Well, thank you both ever so much. We've now reached the end of this session on Beyond the Product, Research Information Management Systems and Use Cases in the US. And I'd like to thank Brenna and Jan very much for their very interesting presentation. We've now got a short 5-minute break to allow you to transition over to the next session, which is focusing on recording research impact in Pure. experiences of the College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences. So hopefully see you all there. Thank you very much.